because I was new to Toronto at the time, still relatively new to Toronto. So to see someone telling a story where, like you said, he's walking around streets that I could recognize and having these conversations with a backdrop that was right outside my window, it just made it feel more real and more obtainable or something for me, you
know. Welcome to the Chesterfield. I'm your host, Ben Rayner. Now, as you know, the Chesterfield is a place where Canadian artists talk about their favorite Canadian art. What you might not know is that the Chesterfield is brought to you by Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, which is a grassroots organization founded by Canadians just like you who care about telling their own stories in their own country. Now, we rely on the support of individual Canadians just like you for our continued existence. So if you want to get involved and maybe make a donation, just check out the link in the video description to follow, and you can sign up and qualify for cool stuff like free records, free books, and feel a part of something kind of cool. Friends.ca. That's all I'm saying. Check it out after the video. And now onto the show. This is a fun one for me because I'm a bit of a comic book kid. Our guest today is Jeff Lemire, who a lot of Canadians know as the artist and graphic novelist who worked with Gord Downie on the Secret Path project a couple of years ago, including an animated special that aired on CBC. He's also the author of the Essex County trilogy, which was named one of Canada's essential works of literature by Canada Reads. Jeff's cool because he, at the same time that he works on like big Marvel and DC comic book titles like the X-Men, Justice League, and Moon Knight, he always finds time to come home and write these incredible personal, small-scale works of Canadiana when he's left to his own devices. And as his crucial work of Canadian art today, he's picked something very much in that vein. A graphic novel by fellow Toronto artist Seth called It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken. Really cool piece of work, really cool guy to talk to. Why don't we get Jeff on the line? I think he's on the other side of Toronto, and let's dive deep. Hello, Jeff Lemire. Thanks for joining us here on the Chesterfield. Are you in Toronto too?
I am. I'm in Toronto. I'm in Leslieville.
You know, I have this image of you living in a barn in rural Ontario somewhere. But I think that's just from all your books.
I escaped the barn when I was 19, so that's where I grew up. But I moved here when I was 19, I guess, and I haven't left.
Well, here on the Chesterfield, we ask Canadian creators such as yourself to discuss one of their favorite pieces of Canadian art, and you picked a really good one. And I actually have a prop today. It's Seth's graphic novel, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken. I reread it last night. It's so good. I really do feel there's a kinship between you and Seth in terms of some of the I guess the more personal and smaller scale stuff you do. So I'm very curious. I mean, I'd love to know how you discovered this wonderful piece of comic book.
Well, this one was interesting. It's kind of a seminal work for me. I think it really pushed me in the right direction. I was, obviously I grew up in rural Ontario in a small town on a farm, and like I had said earlier, I moved here when I was 19, 20 to go to school, and then after school I went to film school, but I never really pursued film. Obviously, I started doing comics more seriously while I was at school, and when I got out of school, this would have been late 90s, early 2000s. I was trying to do comics, but not really finding my voice, I guess. I was just doing stuff that felt derivative, and it wasn't really going anywhere. Around that time, I started going to the Beguiling in Toronto, which was a great comic shop, and Seth and Chester Brown, and so that early Toronto crew of cartoonists would be hanging around there, and seeing those guys in the flesh a little bit. I never really introduced myself or anything, but just, growing up in a small town, people who made comics were so out of reach from me, they were like in a different world, and so seeing these cartoonists like Seth in the flesh and seeing people who kind of grew up in similar places that I grew up making comics kind of pointed the way towards a different way of making comics, and in this book in particular, Seth he's in the city, obviously, but he kind of travels back to where he grew up, which is actually really close to where I grew up at Tilbury, which is right near Essex County. And I think just reading that and seeing sort of that personal story and him sort of depicting a part of Ontario that I knew, it was like, the kind of things you don't normally see in art and comics. And it kind of pointed me towards going back to where I grew up and telling more personal stories with Essex County and things like that. And and that kind of was me finding my voice finally, after a few years of sort of floundering and just sort of trying all kinds of different things that weren't really me. So yeah, I always kind of have a fondness for this for Seth in particular, but for this book particularly.
Well, it's so nice. I mean, it's sort of like when you see a movie or a TV show and it's an undisguised version of some Canadian city. It's actually Toronto. It's not trying to be Chicago or something. And I do love that you see, the insurance building at University in Queen and the weather vanes turning red and stuff like that. It does. I think it just maybe because we're so used to not seeing our own stories told in so many. I mean, it's changed over time, but when you and I are about the same age when we were kids, it was like kind of unheard of to have a comic book set or a graphic novel set in Canada, right? Or a movie or anything. And I think maybe that helps it resonate a little more deeply.
Absolutely, yeah. And even I was speaking of the stuff where he goes back to where he grew up, but even the stuff in Toronto, because I was new to Toronto at the time, still relatively new to Toronto. So to see someone telling a story where, like you said, he's walking around streets that I could recognize and having these conversations with a backdrop that was right outside my window, it just made it feel more real and more obtainable or something for me, whereas when you're growing up reading all these comics that take place in New York City and all these things, it just feels like another world. And yeah, it just really resonated, I guess. And it made the city too felt like a character in the book in a really cool way. That made me kind of love Toronto. And I think a lot of it too, I was thinking a lot about it last night of what I would talk about with this book, but I think a lot of it was too, I grew up, near Windsor in Essex County. And to be honest, the culture there when I was growing up, all the radio and television that we got as kids was all from Detroit. So,
oh yeah, you got it bad. I grew up on the border in New Brunswick too, so I understand.
Yeah, and it was weird. I didn't realize it at the time, but Canada didn't really feel like, it felt like somewhere else almost, Canada, like I would see Toronto on the CBC and stuff, but it felt like that felt like more of a foreign country than the States did to me in a lot of ways, until I moved here. And so I think this book kind of having a real Canadian identity, it kind of, it was enlightening as well and kind of pushed me a little bit to try to capture some of that in my early work and not be afraid to sort of embrace Canada.
Also the willingness to tackle kind of smaller human stories in an art form that for a long time was just associated with larger than life characters, right? And it's good to have bellwethers like that, people to kind of lay the bricks.
Exactly. And that's part of it too, growing up, I was mostly reading Marvel and DC comics because that's all you could really get at the corner store or wherever where I grew up, right? So
the Guardian drugs for me, yes.
Yeah. Becker's or whatever, Max Milk, those were like all the gold mines. But so I wasn't really exposed to sort of more literary sort of graphic novels that were coming out of Europe or other places. And so it wasn't until I moved here and had access to like really good comic stores that I kind of started to see the potential of the medium. And it's still, because when I was in my late teens, early 20s, comics kind of stopped speaking to me in a lot of ways because the stuff was just, like I said, the Marvel and DC stuff I kind of was outgrowing. And then I found all this whole treasure trove of new stuff here from Europe and from the underground and independent cartoonists that did speak to me and did speak to the person I was as, a 20-year-old and onwards. So it kind of reinvigorated my love of the medium in a lot of ways too.
Well, I like too you'll go and write or draw these books for a company like DC or Marvel and go do Animal Man or Moon Knight or all these cool things. And like option things out for movies and miniseries and stuff. But I like that when it comes time to do another novel, it's generally like quite small scale, rural Canadian, Northern Ontario, Essex County, that kind of thing. So is that like kind of a release of pressure for you after doing things? I mean, you do seem to straddle two worlds, right? But it feels like when you come home, you really come home. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I guess so. I think a lot of it comes down to the stuff that I like to draw. Tends to be that kind of stuff, the more quieter, personal, sort of smaller scale things, more human drama stuff. And it suits my style more, whereas my art style isn't really suited to that more bombastic, big, genre-driven stuff. So but the joy of being able to write and collaborate with other artists is that I get to kind of do both those things, you know, the big and the small. But yeah, I mean, when it comes time to do my own thing, I kind of always kind of come back home to a degree, and it is sort of a refuge from the grind of doing the monthly comics or you know, coming up with these big plots and these big genre things that can kind of reach I guess a more commercial audience.
Well, I can see in one of the other kind of kinships I see between the work of Seth and your more personal works is also like the incredible sense of detail, like like a really good eye for detail. I know you did like a snowmobile trip around Hudson's Bay, right, before you did Roughneck, and Essex County is obviously where you grew up. Is it important for you to kind of go and experience those landscapes that you're writing about?
I hadn't thought much about that, but the stuff that all the stuff that I draw myself, like the personal stuff, it does tend to be places I know really well, you know, whether it's where I grew up or parts of Northern Ontario that I spent a lot of time as a kid, or with Roughneck and Secret Path and stuff that I didn't know that landscape very well. So I went up there and kind of experienced it. And yes, I think maybe I do need to know those things on a little bit more of an immediate way and kind of be there to kind of know how to draw it and know how to express it. Yeah.
What's another, there's like maybe that what they like Jung would call a meaningful coincidence that the Seth book, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weekend, that you picked was the title of a Tragically Hip tune before you collaborated with Gord Downie on Secret Path. And we should talk about Secret Path because I mean, not only is it a beautiful piece of work and an important piece of work, but it kind of catapulted you to it kind of made you a little bit more of a known quantity at home outside the comic book world. I guess Essex County trilogy did too, but I feel like that, you know, the CBC special and stuff, it kind of brought a whole new audience to you, eh? In a very nice way, like in a deserving way, I think.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, I think it was great in that, you know, the music audiences, people that know the hip, it's generally a pretty different crowd from the people that read comics, you know? So I think that was kind of one of the good things when Gord and I first connected, is that we could both kind of bring our fan bases that we had that were separate together in a weird way, you know. And it's funny because I'll go to Europe or the States to do signings and things, and you'll see all these comic book fans who all of a sudden know Gord Downie, and they never would have, you know. And it's
that's so cool, I think.
But anyways, yeah, it was cool. Obviously, it was the spotlight put on that project would have been big anyway, but then when Gord was sick and it made it so much bigger than even it would have been, and we couldn't really have anticipated that. But yeah, it was pretty intense in a lot of ways, the whole project.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about Canadian stories though, and the stories of our treatment, you know, like our institutional treatment of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit people is. I mean, there's not a better Canadian story to tell, and that one doesn't get told very often. So it's, you know,
yeah. I mean, for me, it was interesting because I had, you know, my earlier work, it kind of touched on a more, I guess in some ways like a nostalgic look at small town Canada and Canadiana and the golden age of hockey and all these kind of cool things about Canada that I love, but it kind of glossed over this whole other part of our history, you know, and Gord and I, that's one of the first things we talked about was how both of us, him in Kingston and me in Essex County, when we were in school, you know, all through grade school, all through high school, neither of us, the subject of residential schools and the way that, you know, the whole history of the way we treat our Indigenous people here was never talked about at all in any of our schools, you know, and while this wasn't really our story to tell, you know, obviously being two white guys, we did think that, well, maybe if two artists kind of have a following and you know, Gord especially is such an iconic figure that if we could open a dialogue a bit more and point people towards things we didn't learn in school, that it would be worth doing. So
we are maybe better at telling the more modest and human stories than I think there's, you know, like maybe if we have an aptitude as storytellers in this country, like what would you say it would be?
Oh God.
Now, because you straddle both worlds, you can do the big Americans. You can fake it as an American.
I think it's cool that we can, I mean, for instance, my work gets all over the world now, you know, like Roughneck or Essex County and stuff. So I'm bringing little Canadian stories to like people in Brazil or to in Spain, people follow my work, and so then it's cool that they get to see a little slice of something very specifically Canadian and can find something universal in it that speaks to them.
It's been a real pleasure having you on the Chesterfield. Thanks so much for doing this.
Oh man, my pleasure. Thanks.